A note before we begin. The conversations in this episode were recorded before the Hamas attack in Israel in October 2023 and Israel's months-long genocidal violence against Palestine. The State of Israel, with the help of the US and other major governments across the globe, has killed over 25,000 Palestinians and counting. While much of the discussion for this episode focuses on LGBTQ issues in the US, these issues cannot be separated from the settler colonialism of the US and other major governments across the world, which both US political parties, Republicans and Democrats, uphold in supporting Israel's unceasing attacks and restriction of Palestinians' access to resources like water, food, shelter, medicine, internet, electricity, and so on. We support a free Palestine.
Welcome to Unlivable Cultures. Unlivable Cultures is a podcast making with borrowing from anthropology, social theory, and other forms of knowledge for a more livable world. My name is Cody Scahan. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm joined by my co-hosts.
I'm Julia Coverdale, and I use they, them pronouns.
And my name is Clayton Gerard, and I use he, him pronouns. Yeah, to get us started today, we are doing a little experiment in narrative and storytelling because over the course of the past, 2 or year and a half since we started recording this podcast, we have recorded 2 or 3 episodes at this point on like LGBTQ issues, and usually by the time we have it edited and on a schedule, it seems almost obsolete. Or I guess instead of saying obsolete, I'll just say like there's just plenty of new stuff coming down the hatch, plenty of new shit coming out of the pipes. So this is going to be an experiment in like storytelling in 3 parts. So over the past year and a half, we have, including this episode, 3 different recordings that we're going to merge together to kind of give a story of how things have changed, what issues have come to the fore, and feelings, emotions, and stakes that are in the present.
I think it's an interesting like snapshot, I guess, into what was happening at those times and also like where we were at in our lives, which I think is just really interesting. And I think it'll be interesting to listen to all together.
Maybe. We'll see. So, that being said, we recorded our first episode on queer topics in the summer of 2022. Then we recorded a episode on trans media, specifically in response to the New York Times debacle that happened in like February of 2023. And then we are recording this in October of 2023 because so much shit has continued to hit the fan. So with that, I'll turn it over to our first LGBTQ episode recorded in the summer of 2022. As a fun fact, this was the second podcast episode we ever recorded together. This is a condensed version of the conversation where we talk about the It Gets Better campaign and Jasbir Puar's critique of the campaign in her first chapter of Right to Maim.
And so today we're going to be talking about specifically the It Gets Better project. The co-creators are Dan Savage and his partner. I believe his partner's name is Terry Miller. And if you're not familiar with Dan Savage, he's a columnist. His column's called Savage Love. And on this column, he wrote, in the context of recent queer suicides and specifically the suicide of Billy Lucas, he wrote, "I wish I could have talked to this kid for 5 minutes. I wish I could have told Billy that it gets better. I wish I could have told him that. However bad things were, however isolated and alone he was, it gets better." There's just a lot going on in that kind of statement. So we're kind of here to, first of all, unpack a few of the, biases and inherent exclusions. He's this really successful, fairly wealthy, fairly cosmopolitan, white, homonormative subject. that is writing, it gets better, and telling these kids who are suffering from bullying, homophobia, all of these things from their peers and from the world as a whole, and saying, oh, it eventually gets better. You just have to draw yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yeah, I will say I was out all of high school, and I was a pretty active figure in like my high school's GSA. So like I was around a lot of this community that was
Such an all-star queer.
Maybe, I don't know. And like I was around a lot of those people. Like in high school, I never really experienced that bullying, but I knew kids who did, because as we got further in the Trump presidency, like the incoming freshmen would get like more and more homophobic and transphobic. And so I witnessed a lot of these like students getting bullied and not getting like support from the administration. And I don't remember if they really ever watched the It Gets Better videos, but I know even without the videos, like the sentiment has always been kind of like around. And I remember like experiencing that myself. And I do think that like it's a good short-term like fix to this problem, but I do think that you run into a problem where like if it doesn't get better once they leave these spaces, and like in the future, like you are setting these queer children like up for failure, and I think up also for like a worse mental state in the future.
Yeah, just the idea that in the past, just that someone can exist and say it gets better, like the fact that they lived 20 more years than you and that they have a life and a partner of the same gender, that meant something more than I would say it means now.
Yeah, I think that the It Gets Better campaign just generally highlights a lot of cis heteronormative or homonormative values a lot of queer assimilationists have. Like, what does better mean for these people who are on the margins of society that society does not value and does not want life to get better for? I think that the campaign is like misses out on a lot of that stuff. I also think that like from my remembrance, a lot of the people who make these videos are like well-known queer people. Are those really the people, that should be speaking about how like life will get better for like queer individuals as a whole?
In one video where he was talking about the impact of the movement, so years later with him and his partner, he said the exact phrase, and I quote it, and there was other context, so like it does sound better in context, but he said, "It did get better. I made it get better." And I was like, that's a very big cringe. You can't just put the burden on the individual. Like, that's not how this works. Another person, like, specifically said this, that was also very cringy. If you end it, the bullies will win. Ooh. And it's like, I get the sentiment, but like, why are we sitting here talking about like a competition?
There's just like generally this weird like vibe about like some anti-bullying like campaigns, and thoughts of the bullying and the trauma that you've experienced from that has like made you a stronger and better person. And it's like, actually, I think if I didn't experience that trauma, I would be better off.
Yeah. There was one other like sentiment that I also wanted to bring up. I feel very conflicted with, even before this discussion or anything like that, just in narratives of like coming out and being yourself and stepping into your true self and loving and living honestly and all that other stuff. One person had mentioned that the hardest part was them knowing who they are, but not being able to be their true self around others, which I get on some level, but then on the other level, I don't necessarily get. I don't say that to like invalidate other people that have felt that kind of way, but it's just not my experience. And I guess the conflict that I have is it becomes this trope within every coming out narrative. Coming out itself is basically seen as pretty much a rite of passage.
Yeah.
And there is one article that I've really appreciated that kind of like makes me think about it in more nuanced ways, called The Whiteness of Coming Out, Culture and Identity in the Disclosure Narrative. And it's by Asiel Sanchez, and they kind of talk about being a queer Latino person. That's how they describe themselves, and talk about the complexities of like having a Latin heritage and being from Mexico And just the idea of talking about your sexuality with your family is just like against ideals of like tradition and modesty and like those different things. And they basically say coming out to their father as quote unquote gay and presenting their partner as like a boyfriend would be very reductive, because they're like, my father already knows that, this isn't just a friendship and it's not just a romantic relationship. And also they say, similarly, to say I'm non-binary would render my gender incomprehensible to my father. There's no way that he can understand where I'm coming from because there's nothing he can connect it to in Mexican culture. But at the same time, they kind of make the alternate statement of aligning and conforming to this white framework that our queer culture is structured by shrouds the cultural richness of queerness and their Mexican heritage, the ways in which people in their culture have expressed and inhabited queer subjectivities, like traditionally in the culture. All that is lost if you're having to strictly conform to white cultural norms and standards of the LGBTQ community. One thing that I would quote is, mainstream narratives of coming out imply a white subjectivity, one that forgets the influence of culture, family, and heritage. For many queer people of color, coming out is a much more nuanced process than a single moment of verbal disclosure. We come out in silence between the refusal of mainstream queer narratives to acknowledge our culture and the refusal of our culture to acknowledge our sexuality and gender. We come out in actions rather than words, because we have to navigate our gender and sexuality in terms of a very different cultural profile. Terms like gay, trans, and non-binary aren't universal. They have radically different meanings in different cultural contexts.
I think even in terms of like white queerness, like the coming out narrative as like this moment of like announcing your identity to the world and like finally knowing who you are is just like a really messy thing. Like I was somebody that was outed, and like coming out for me has always been a very, very traumatic thing. So I just think that like these narratives really forget that like it's not clean for a lot of people, and that like it can get worse for people if they come out instead of just like getting better.
One of the articles I was reading to kind of prep for this had mentioned that we're coming up on the like generation of people that listen to It Gets Better videos, turning around and making It Gets Better videos. So it's kind of this like second generation point that we're at. And this first generation that started this, that made these videos, I think it meant a lot more to them to make the videos. And I don't want to like invalidate impacts that it could have had on people, but I'm just saying, like, from their perspective, growing up queer or trans or however they identify, and not having anyone to look to in media or in their everyday life, having a video saying of someone with a similar experience saying it gets better carries a whole lot of different meaning. The article that got me thinking of this is called Unscripting Queer Subjectivity, Queer Futures Envisioned in quote unquote It Gets Better. And this is by Sarah Schmidt. Basically, Schmidt kind of talks about It Gets Better videos and the evolving narratives of queer lives, the ways that the scripts kind of structure queer subjects and surveil them at the same time, and like the ways that it is very homonormative in a lot of ways. But like, because so many people recognize the failure of the campaign, that in itself creates potential for, It Gets Better to be useful. So basically, like, at this point, everybody recognizes that It Gets Better is problematic in a lot of ways with how normative it can be. But it's because we've seen that and we're having these conversations that the campaign is really successful now, because we're getting past just accepting the normativities and we're centering a conversation about troubling those narratives. And that's where it becomes more queer and more substantive. And they say supporting LGBTQ youth should not mean continuing homonormalizing ideas, but meeting youth where they are and expanding our imaginations. So kind of like using this not as a way to surveil coming out narratives and like queer subjecthood narratives, but as a way to kind of use it as an entry point and then allow queer youth to kind of forge their own paths and like allow that to become a more expansive participation in the queer community and queer life. This is a figuring of futurity that we're not really realizing because like by perpetuating these narratives, we're kind of setting a path and then telling people to, or surveilling people to follow this pathway of what it means to be queer. Like doing this, it gets better. And you'll know it gets better because in my video, I have a partner and a kid and we go on vacation.
From the introduction of Poir's book, she writes, "How useful is it to imagine troubled gay youth might master their injury and turn blame and guilt into transgression, triumph, and all-American success? Savage's retro-homo repro-futurism, a coin turned by Dana Luciano to describe the projection of one's own past into the youth of today in order to rise one's own ordinary life into exceptional progress narrative, functions to misread the impasse of the present as an inability to imagine the future." In his closing imperative statement, "You have to live," Savage capitalizes on neoliberal sentiment that detaches individual well-being from any collective social responsibility. So I think what really resonates with what you're saying here is what the article you're talking about and what Poir talks about and what I've been talking about envisions less of like this sort of interventionist or like, specific way of looking at what it means to care for someone and what it means to care about their future and envision their future. And it's a much more holistic view of this is how we actually engender the positive social conditions and give queer youth the words and the ideas and the space to like kind of live it into their own future rather than trying to constrain or say what their future should be with a sort of interventionist mode of care.
Yeah, I also feel like this idea about the future getting better always for queer youth just sets queer youth up for failure. But I also think that it's consistent with this kind of continual idea that we are always progressing and getting better, that now is the most progressive time, the best time to be queer ever. And I think that this past year, with all of the horrific anti-trans legislation, I think we're seeing that this like progressivism, that we're always progressing and getting better, is not the case. And I think that we are not only setting up kids for failure individually when we're saying that it gets better and then it does not get it better in their lives, but that we're also setting up our own community for failure when we think that we will always not have to worry about this surveillance into our privacy and our identities and all of those things. And I think that when we are setting stuff up as like we will get better, and so we don't necessarily need like these strong like political activism, the strong like mutual aid with each other, and instead it's more of an individualized outlook on queer activism. I think that we are setting not just the individual but the community itself up for failure.
Yeah, I think this kind of moment where there's this panic of like, oh, things are gonna get really, like, things are getting really bad, and they are, but like at the same time, it's like, no, it got better, but for some people, it stayed bad for a lot of people. It's kind of just like representative of the politics that we have in general at the moment. Like when homosexuality was declassified as a psychiatric condition in the DSM in like the 1960s and 70s, trans people were scapegoated. Like that was a huge point where sexuality and sex and gender were distinguished, and then all of a sudden, like, maybe we don't have a category explicitly for homosexuality in the DSM, but we do have one for gender deviance, and then it becomes gender dysphoria, and then, you know, all these other things, even to the present day, like this focus on same-sex marriage being legalized. And yes, that was a positive step, but at the same time, like, conservative politics rallies a very robust attack on trans rights over the past like 7 years since, and just the story of queer politics is the white gay man scapegoating the others. So
I think that's like really in line too with like all of the discussions this year of how like all of like the white cis gay men that I've seen be like, now we're under attack because Clarence Thomas mentioned Obergefell in his dissenting opinion. And it's like, we have been under attack this entire year. Trans kids and trans adults have been under attack in ways that they have not been for a while. There's been much more concerted and like focused effort against trans people this year.
like just starting with bathroom bills
Yeah.
years ago, and then just the slow, gradual incline.
Yeah. And also it's like because of the like now like very abundantly clear like anti-trans stuff, it has then caused also like all of these very what we would probably consider like old school homophobic notions of like queer people being groomers to like resurge, and also, you know, all of the attacks on drag performers, but especially drag queens, which in itself is like wrapped up within transphobia.
I think that's interesting to think about a little bit, because I think part of the sort of affirmation of the value is how viral the It Gets Better project went, which I think there's so many things that are well-intentioned and, you know, they're presumed to be doing some good. I think how Fore connects this to slow death is really important and interesting. Lauren Bland's concept of slow death is what Fore uses to kind of de-individualize the It Gets Better project and the problem it's trying to address. So rather than sort of individualizing the responsibility, Fore shifts the concept to the systemic causes of certain people and certain populations that are marked out for wearing out and eventual death through Berland's concept of slow death. That kind of also goes against the narrative of the It Gets Better project of that's futuristic oriented, that's saying, oh, one day you'll get there, one day it will get better. And the slow death concept, I think, really highlights how for many people it may not.
Yeah, it's wild. And like specifically speaking to the concept and theory of debility that Fore uses, it's just very relevant and resonant with these politics as we're talking, because like the connections are not hard to make, honestly, when you're talking about debility.
Yeah, and I was just going to point out, I don't know if you all have heard about the story of the trans man in Ohio who tried to use the men's restroom and then was told to use the women's restroom. And then the women thought that he was a trans woman and called other men to come and beat him up, and then he got arrested. But like that story just shows there's no winning for trans people, especially I think when it comes to the bathroom situation, and that they're not wanting to like police or bring back sex equaling gender, but that they're wanting like trans people to not exist. He literally did what like transphobes want him to do, and then he got hate crimed. And it just is like pointing to me that transphobes, it's not that they are wanting this like reasonable like solution to the transgender problem, it's that they are wanting trans people to not exist.
Thinking of that example you just brought up, Julia, and like with this concept of debility and how that functions specifically for queer folks, and Fore uses the Berlantian slow death to encapsulate this like gradual loss, almost this gradual trajectory towards death, and kind of defines it as, where's that? Berlant moves us away from the event of trauma or catastrophe, proposing that, quote, slow death occupies the temporalities of the endemic, end quote. So it's not necessarily that like these huge catastrophic moments like bills enacted in different states, like those are huge moments, but at the same time it's like everyday moments of going to a public restroom and experiencing that kind of like transphobia leads to arrest. And then the arrest, like, one, can get on your record, two, like missing work with all the legal stuff that's going on because of it, all the ripple effects, those are everyday things that make life harder and harder and harder and limit a person's capacity for other things. So it's like almost non-events of like going to a bathroom. I guess I'm trying to say all this to kind of get at the idea of debility being something that gradually increases and makes it harder for queer people to live, for trans people to live, for non-binary people to live. And then you get to this point, like you're saying, Julia, of the point is just to not have trans people in society. That's kind of the idea that affirming your child's gender and seeking services that would aid that, like being considered child abuse, that severely limits what a parent, caretaker, doctor, teacher can do for a child. Obviously, these things relate to mental health and suicide and other conditions and self-harm behaviors and everything else. So like what can be considered these like non-events, these like everyday things that aren't catastrophes, the ripple effects of this are very debilitating in a way that is specific to queer folks, to basically, not just debilitate, but to disappear them from society.
It's like the emphasis on like, it's a very interlinked approach to basically it's an assault on everyday life, which I think is what a lot of people don't kind of recognize. Legislation is passed that affects other people. Like it's not just legislation, obviously, that has these effects on everyday life, but also creating this sort of climate of hostility and creating issues such as the bathroom issue that became so talked about recently.
I think that's part of the problem or the shortcoming of a lot of this rhetoric that Puar tries to point out with It Gets Better, of like the onus is not on the individual to just do anything you can. It's a collective.
The biggest thing on the individual level you could do is literally just starting to engage within queer community that you know exists, like where you live.
Get involved in our homosexual agenda.
Yes.
Some concluding thoughts for me. I think it's really important for us to kind of ground this conversation that we're having in this current moment, especially with the politics that are going on. It's a very intense moment. And I mean, obviously recognizing my privilege as a white queer man, like I just want to hold both of those in tension of like, it is a really serious and intense moment, but like it has been that way for a lot of communities and a lot of people for a long time. I don't want to kind of gloss over things just for the sake of valuing resiliency and kind of putting that on a pedestal, because that's kind of one of the sentiments we talked about for the It Gets Better campaign, is kind of valorizing resiliency when it should be a collective action, a strategy to make this world more livable, make it a better place for everyone, specifically those on the margins. Puar talks about slow death and debility and what factors in our culture and society are debilitating people in the almost non-events of their everyday life, that's slowly leading them to want this kind of escape, as we're talking about queer youth suicide.
I think that It Gets Better campaign, I think the current political moment that we are in, it really highlights a lot of the problems with the campaign and a lot of the problems that Puar pointed out. But I also think that it can get better, but that getting better is not an individualized practice. And it is something that as a community, we all need to take and work together to achieve. And I don't want to end this on a negative note and saying that everything is just so terrible and there's no, it's important to remember that the only way that it will get better is if we all work together and create a better future for queer people, and not just white cis queer people, but all queer people, especially those at the margins that have always been the most harmed.
And now we will transition to our second segment, which was recorded in the spring of 2023. We discussed the open letter penned by New York Times contributors, which critiqued the journal's coverage of trans issues. And we also draw on the broader issues and context of anti-trans legislations that were sweeping across the U.S. So did anyone come up with a tagline for today?
I don't know that there's a fun, catchy way to tagline.
I mean, we could always shit on New York Times.
That's true. Or J.K. Rowling. A little bit of both.
Maybe that's our tagline. Welcome to Unlivable Cultures, where we shit on the New York Times and J.K. Rowling if she comes up, and sometimes if she doesn't.
Well, she will come up because I don't know if you saw, but after the employee resistance thing was published, the New York Times immediately published an opinion piece in defense of J.K. Rowling. So
yeah, that was a whole thing.
Welcome to the podcast where we tell you why you should not play Hogwarts Legacy.
Nice.
Works for
Remove
me.
that Hogwarts house out of your bios now. I don't know. J.K. Rowling has a very specific amount of power that a lot of other people don't necessarily have.
Called money. And whiteness.
Yeah. And white womanness, especially in the way that she talks about trans stuff. I don't know if you guys read her whole essay on trans people in 2020 when she released that, but it's a whole bunch of bullshit.
I started reading it and I just did not get through it because
I think that's fair because it's awful and a lot.
So, since we're 15 minutes in, shall we set the scene for our discussion?
Perhaps we shall. Maybe that would be good.
Do you want me to go and then you can fill in some gaps and flesh it out, Julia?
That sounds good, yeah. Sorry.
Okay, cool. So today we have come together to discuss a lot of things. So
this is just a very general episode so far.
We should just have a whole episode of non-information, saying a bunch of vague things that we never actually speak specifics. Anyway, so there is a ton of anti-LGBTQ, specifically anti-trans legislation going around the country. Anti-trans issues have been a hot button topic. Topics around transitioning, transgender youth, and even the trans community in general, or just gender expansive youth and non-binary gender presentation or expression or identification. All of these are extremely hot button topics in the political sphere at the moment, and also just in our social systems. Today, we're kind of entering into this conversation about trans issues by taking the example of the recent New York Times debacle and kind of unfurling some of that story and then expanding into the broader context of all these issues. So, just as a little overview, in early February 2023, the New York Times came under fire from an open letter of a ton of New York Times contributors and other people that calls out how the legacy newspaper has covered transgender issues in a negative light. As of February 16th, over 1,000 contributors to the New York Times, among them eminent writers, artists, photographers, and holders of elected office, and the counter signatures of 23,000 media workers, readers, and subscribers to the newspaper were a part of this open letter. So in this open letter, the writers called out the New York Times for not handling trans issues in a way that it should appropriately. This letter was addressed to Philip B. Corbet, Associate Managing Editor for Standards at the New York Times. So this was meant to be, from the very beginning, going to the high up. One part that I'll read from the letter says, the newspaper's editorial guidelines demand that reporters, quote, preserve a professional detachment free of any whiff of bias, unquote, when cultivating their sources, remaining, quote, sensitive that personal relationships with news sources can erode into favoritism in fact or appearance, unquote. Yet the Times has in recent years treated gender diversity with an eerily familiar mix of pseudoscience and euphemistic charged language while publishing reporting on trans children that omits relevant information about its sources. So they're critiquing the Times for talking about these issues without granting it the proper legitimacy and background practice that is expected of the Times editorial standards. And they're not really exhaustively vetting the sources that they're using and the ways that they're contributing to a lot of the discourse around trans issues going on nationally. So that was the content of the letter. Julia, do you have anything that you would add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add kind of a specific example of kind of the lack of journalistic rigor that this letter is referencing. So this is a specific tweet from Aaron Reed at Aaron in the Morn, who covers a lot of the statewide anti-trans legislation, as well as just general anti-trans media and articles. So she talked about when this entire letter was released, and she tweeted, remembering that one time where the evidence didn't say that gender-affirming care was harmful to trans youth, so the New York Times created its own analysis commissioned by the Times with no listed author or peer review process to say they were. And so just to kind of quote from the article what Aaron is talking about, the article, one of their opinion pieces, I'm pretty sure, criticizes or kind of like debates the efficacy of transition within minors. And so this is specifically what this source is from. And so the quote is, "The drugs suppress estrogen and testosterone, hormones that help develop the reproductive system, but also affect the bones, the brain, and other parts of the body. During puberty, bone mass typically surges, determining a lifetime of bone health. When adolescents are using blockers, bone density growth flatlines on average, according to an analysis commissioned by the Times of observational studies examining the effects." And so I just wanted to add that in there as kind of a more concrete example of what we're talking about.
Yeah, thanks. That is really important and enlightening to include. Other examples that they mention directly in this open letter is an article from Emily Bazelon called "The Battle Over Gender Therapy," in which Bazelon uses the term patient zero to refer to a trans child seeking gender-affirming care, which is a phrase that vilifies transness as a disease to be feared, as patient zero is often used in narratives around contagion. Another example that they use is Katie Baker's recent piece, "When Students Change Gender Identity and Parents Don't Know." They say it misframed the battle over children's right to safely transition. It doesn't make clear that court cases brought by parents who want schools to out their trans children are actually part of a legal strategy pursued by anti-trans hate groups. And these groups also have called trans people an existential threat to society and seek to replace the American public education system with more Christian homeschooling, those types of conservative pushes for public education. So this Times piece kind of culminates around the fact that such articles in some ways can be seen as insignificant, like one article out of hundreds that are published every day. But they say the natural destination of poor editorial judgment is the court of law, and it references a bunch of different cases over the past year or couple years where works like these articles just mentioned have been referenced by lawmakers to specifically pass anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ bills. So without the journalistic rigor that they're saying is required for engaging in this types of coverage for such sensitive issues, they're saying that without this journalistic rigor, it's perpetuating a lot of the harm that is being leveraged against trans youth and the trans community more broadly. And then it also goes into talk more about the media aspect of the New York Times and this responsibility as a journal, as like a public media outlet. There's a responsibility for media to uphold a certain rigor and a certain thoroughness that they say the New York Times hasn't been employing on these types of issues. And then they also tie it back to, controversies around homosexuality in the 60s and 70s. And one of the parts that they mention is in the 80s, they say the Time Style Guide was updated to include the following dictum, which stood until 1987. And it follows, do not use gay as a synonym for homosexual unless it appears in the formal capitalized name of an organization or in quoted matter. They also mention how Times publisher author Ox Sulzberger sent down an order to stop covering these people, meaning homosexuals, in any of their news coverage. So it's that kind of bias that they trace on the issue of homosexuality that they're tying to this issue of trans youth and schools and this whole debate around parents' rights and attack against the trans community. So that's kind of what I'm envisioning is kind of the launching pad for our discussion to talk about, trans issues, how they are being perpetuated throughout the nation and different policies, different legislation, different social issues, and then also how media perpetuates these biases and how they really shape the attitudes and ideologies that we see manifesting in its material effects.
And I just wanted to add on to this as well, just kind of some other context. So it was I think it was like a day or two after this open letter from the 200 New York Times contributors was released. The New York Times released an opinion piece titled In Defense of J.K. Rowling. Obviously, there's some optics there, given that I would say that J.K. Rowling has had a large amount of impact in the current anti-trans discussion, which, given the time period of releasing this after the open letter, as well as her new game, which is a hot button topic, I would argue that she has been kind of the arbiter of this entire gender identity discussion on a large scale. It is definitely a choice to release that article immediately after this. In addition, I also wanted to kind of add some number context about these anti-LGBTQ bills that are being proposed currently in the United States. So for the 2023 legislative session, according to the ACLU, they're currently tracking 321 anti-LGBTQ bills in the United States. Most of those are anti-trans, or they may be tangentially anti-trans, like the anti-drag bills are in essence anti-trans as well. And I just wanted to kind of give some context. That's the number for this year. The legislative session is not over, and I know that the number of bills last year was also high. And then for kind of just some more local context, Kansas currently has 9 bills that have been introduced. I personally do not think that they will pass. Historically, Laura Kelly has vetoed bills such as these, and the legislative has not had enough voting power to overturn her veto. But I just think it's important to mention just the sheer number.
And it's also important to note that, even if these bills aren't passed, they are still doing harm. Not only are they contributing to this vitriolic discourse that manifests in the bullying and harassment of trans youth and the trans community, but also it manifests in school board votes and the ways that school boards are making policies, and it manifests in different smaller organizations like that have a profound impact on local communities, but we often don't give them the credit they deserve, because they can be extremely deterministic for people's everyday lives. And follow what you were saying about the amount of bills. In 2022, there were about 315 discriminatory anti-LGBTQ bills, and according to the Human Rights Campaign, and 29 of those passed into law.
No, I was just going to say we've already exceeded that number, and we're not
Oh, yeah.
even really close to being done with the legislative session.
Yeah. So it's wild because 2022 was just another landmark year where the number was like out of the water compared to previous years. The number that I have from the Human Rights Campaign says 340 anti-LGBTQ bills so far this year, and this was published February 15th. So like this just being the first month and a half of 2023, and we already have like well over 300 anti-LGBTQ bills being introduced into legislatures. Like this is a big deal, and there's going to be more. And even though it may seem hopeful that out of the 315, only 29 passed into law, like I said, just introducing these bills and gaining momentum in this discourse can be extremely harmful. And half the time, it doesn't have to go into law to do the harm that they're like wanting to do.
Yeah, I also definitely agree with that. I've seen the impact that this legislation and these debates have had on young trans people. I'm currently the president of like the main queer organization at K-State right now, and I have just been seeing, as well as the advisor for my organization, we've just been seeing the profound mental health effect that these bills are having on especially our trans students, but honestly, all LGBT students. It is definitely deeply affecting them. I know a lot of students who just had to like quit school were admitted to psych wards because of compounding factors, and this is one of those factors.
I think what both of you have brought up is so important, because it is like, I think, as Julia mentioned, you know, the fact that these bills are being introduced like shifts the debate, right? Like that's the whole, I think that's the point of so much legislative efforts. Like, for example, a lot of the recent sort of bills around the Green New Deal and other things like this, like part of the reason for introducing them is not like, you know, even if you don't think they'll be passed or you're skeptical of whether these things will be passed, the purpose of doing it is to shift the terms, the debate, move the conversation to a certain grounding. And so in the case of these anti-LGBTQ bills, it's clearly like to say that this is a legitimate debate that we can hold as a society, to say that like what's being introduced is under question. And of course, like the connections and overlaps with like the debates against the so-called debates, and I am doing air quotes here, against critical race theory, for example, is of course, you know, easy to make with the whole kind of sort of creation of a boogeyman, and the same sort of language being used to like draw up like terror around something that will happen and you know, ruin society, as was argued around like Dungeons and Dragons and witchcraft and all of this stuff in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, I do want to speak to one piece that you mentioned, and it's just like kind of following this thread of how the media is perpetuating this bias and transphobia and like contributing to this harmful discourse. One of the parts of Katie Baker's article that was referenced in that open letter to the New York Times, called "When Students Change Gender Identity and Parents Don't Know," kind of speaks to this conflicting space that parents are in when they find out that the school has been, using a student's preferred pronouns and name, like a name different than what their parents had given them. And then all of a sudden they find out and they feel betrayed by the school and things. And one of the parts that Baker mentions is how this kind of goes across political party lines. She talks about how this isn't just a conservative thing, but liberal parents are having issues with this kind of thing too, and they're feeling violated and punished in some ways with how the school is handling this situation. Baker mentions that a lot of parents that consider themselves liberal, in a lot of instances, she references a tearful mother that says, "On one hand, I'm dealing with my very extreme liberal values of individuality, freedom, expression, sexuality, wanting to support all this stuff. And at the same time, I'm afraid of medicalization. I'm afraid of long-term health. I'm afraid of the fact that my child might change their mind, which we can get into all of the packed language that is there. But I mean, it kind of encapsulates this position where, honestly, the more right-wing side of media has caught on to this really interesting topic that can transcend party lines and make people vote in ways that doesn't align with some of their other values. Baker mentions the lone father in the room at that moment said, "It's politically weird to be a very liberal Democrat and find yourself shoved in bed with like the governor of Texas. Am I supposed to listen to Tucker Carlson?" Like, just this idea that, you know, on the one hand, they feel violated and they feel like they have rights as parents to be involved in this. And then they're being lumped into these conservative realms. Like, I don't know, there is a lot of conflict there. And I think there's a lot of nuance to unpack with how this discourse is kind of parsing people out with, like, you know, a full, as if it has to be completely black or white or yes or no, and not providing complexity and intricacies to each situation. And so, you know, these liberal parents all of a sudden feel like they now have to vote for Greg Abbott or Ron DeSantis just so that they can be involved in this aspect of kids' lives, which is not true. There's a lot to unpack there, but just saying, like, this is a piece of the article that, you know, all of a sudden people are like, oh my gosh, I'm liberal, but I feel this way. Now I have to be Republican.
No, I think that's a really good point, because I think also in general, going beyond just sort of the trans discussion and the anti-LGBTQ bills and everything, like in general, I think you can describe it as like sort of a collusion between politics and media, but it's also just driven by, I think, the form of media itself, the way we consume it, and other cultural factors that, like, a lot of these issues sort of get flattened to a certain extent of, like, it's either this or that, or the way that it's being, because the fact that it is mass media and it's like supposed to reach such a wide audience, like you said, it like loses the local specifics, the local details that are so important for capturing the actual nuance and the significance of these sort of cultural phenomenon, and to describe them as just like these universal political things that we can have like objective, rational conversations about. And news media is, like, I think, problematic sometimes, because it does, you know, especially as in the way that the current media sphere exists, like, it's impossible to have a rational debate about climate change in the national news media, anything like this. It's just, obviously, it's a symptom of both the way that we communicate with one another and the way that we try to hold these sort of conversations in general, and then also just the more insidious, like, anti-LGBTQ sentiments and conservative social attitudes.
Well, and also, I think that the general framing around transgender people has been a framing of debate, as if these are not people's lives, as if these are not people's bodies, that they are choosing what to do with their own bodies. And although the people who kind of oppose a lot of, especially minor transitions or just puberty blockers, they'll point out about regret, despite the fact that detransition numbers are low. And there are, as far as I'm aware, multiple research studies that show the benefit to trans people's mental health that transitioning has. But that's part of the reason that they're focusing on trans youth instead of trans adults, is because they can frame it as these people who don't have a voice are helpless and we need to protect them, when that's not the case. They just don't want to listen to trans youth. And as well, they can frame adult trans people as groomers and harken back to a lot of this, like, age-old homophobic rhetoric that paints gay men especially as groomers, but also lesbians as predators, and especially Black lesbians as predators. And so, like, there's a whole bunch of rhetoric that is tied into this debate that has been specifically chosen so that way political representatives can rile up their base. And I think that we've seen that in a lot of the more recent, like, anti-LGBTQ violence. Club Q comes to mind. The murder of Brianna Gay in the UK also comes to mind. I also know that Charlie Kirk, who is a part of Turning Point USA, recently called for men to handle trans people the way they did in the 50s and 60s. Also, correct me on this because I definitely did not watch the full video, but in the recent video that Donald Trump made talking about running in 2024, that's the year, in 2024, he specifically mentions trans people as like a major part of his platform. And I remember him saying something violent about it, but
he goes at length talking about what he'll do.
I mentally could not watch that. So yeah, if you could elaborate more, I would appreciate that because I just could not do it.
It's been a while since I've seen it, but from my recollection, he basically takes what we've heard from people like Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott and what they're trying to do in Florida and Texas respectively and kind of elevates it to a national level. And then, of course, in Donald Trump's own fashion, he kind of like is like, I'm going to do it bigger and better than they ever could, and just talks at length about how violent he will be to trans folks, about how, you know, he's going to make it illegal to have access to these things. He's going to make it illegal to help people have access to these things and all the other stuff. So I can't call specifics to mind at the moment, but it was very violent rhetoric.
Yeah. And I also just wanted to, I know we've kind of touched on this. I wanted to more specifically touch on the fact that, like, this anti-trans rhetoric is not necessarily a rhetoric from one political party or the other. You know, like, we've mentioned J.K. Rowling, who I would consider a TERF, which is a trans exclusionary radical feminist, and radical feminism would be considered a liberal ideology. A lot of the concerns around women's rights have been kind of structured in a liberal way. And so, like, this is not just a one party issue. And I also think that is, like we've already been discussing, important to just kind of nail down a little bit more on the specifics, if that makes sense.
It's interesting to me, the logical argument of, like, saying, well, we shouldn't have, like, trans youth take puberty blockers, like, in case they want to, like, they regret the transition later on and, you know, want to detransition, as you mentioned. And you said, you know, rates of detransition are very low, and it would be good to, yeah, actually get the statistic on that if we have it. But, like, you know, even if youth wanted to detransition, there's, like, in my mind, if the number is low, even if it isn't, there's perhaps a lot less harm of just, like, letting them try it out, see if it feels comfortable, see if it feels right with their body. And if it doesn't, like, you know, it's there's not the pain of having never had the opportunity to try.
Well, I think part of it requires a lot of sensitivity in just how these talking points are framed, because, well, I get what you're saying. Like, I could easily see someone from the opposing viewpoint latch on to this idea that is perpetuated in a lot of media and discourse of, like, these things can be permanent and, like, they can have permanent side effects. And so, like, even this little exploration, quote unquote, phase, like, can have permanent harm, which I'm more than happy to dive into all of that junk. But Julia, I did see you raised your hand, so.
Yeah, I also just wanted to mention, too, that detransition numbers as well are a little bit misleading, because there are a number of people who don't consent to detransitioning in the sense that, like, it is, they get
I'm
off
shocked,
of,
by the way.
Yeah.
I'm just shocked.
Like, they're forced off of hormones because of parental pressures, societal pressures of being trans, because, like, it is hard to be trans in the world, to get jobs, to exist in the workplace, etc. And I would also mention, too, before you speak, Clayton, sorry, that, like, part of the reason that puberty blockers exist is to delay puberty, and that gives trans people more time to kind of consider transitioning without having to force them to go through basically 2 puberties, one of which would be like detrimental to their mental health.
Yeah.
And one note to that, like there are actual structural factors involved in detransitioning a lot of times. So like if you have a trans person that is being described some psychiatric medication or getting some other medical treatment, sometimes doctors will be like, oh, you need to stop taking this hormone therapy or this other medication because it could be contributing to this, or it just like, whatever else. There are a lot of those things. If a trans person is incarcerated, a lot of times they won't be given the hormones that they need. And so that's a way of like coercive detransitioning, also kind of a form of punishment and torture, just, when you're in that carceral setting. But to have this conversation, I'd love to kind of zoom out a little bit and talk about like what transitioning looks like, and also, what these different nuances are. So one thing to mention is there is typically 2 different transitions spoken about. So there's like social transitioning and medical transitioning. Social transitioning usually encompasses like, changing one's hairstyle or clothing, or choosing a different name, or going by different pronouns. Those are typically considered social transitioning, whereas medical transitioning can encompass like puberty blockers or hormone treatments or different medications, even surgical options. So those are 2 things to distinguish between when we're having this conversation. And let me see, I contributed to a policy brief a couple of months ago that talked about trans affirming care for youth and how it is often conflated with child abuse and neglect, and looking at those statutory definitions, what it really means. So I am going over and looking at that. But an important thing to mention is this concept of gender incongruence when we're talking about these kinds of things. So that is different way of talking about this from like gender identity disorder, which was in the DSM for decades, and then kind of shifted to the gender dysphoria term. Gender incongruence is simply, when someone doesn't feel like their identity kind of reflects the gender that they've been assigned socially in response to the sex that they were assigned at birth. The American Academy of Pediatrics report that children can become aware of gender incongruence as early as 3 to 5 years old. On average, it's about 8.5 years old, but that's when some signs of incongruence start to occur or start to manifest. They report that many do not disclose any feelings of incongruence until the average age of 10. And it's important to note that a lot of times, any conversations around transitioning socially specifically, and not even medically, that doesn't come till later, but doesn't even occur until these kind of later elementary ages, if that's what they can be called. Medical transitioning is not something that is prescribed or even given to people at this age, but it is advocated that children around 10 and in this age where they disclose any feelings of incongruence have space to kind of explore their gender expression. This doesn't even have to result in any kind of medical puberty blockers or anything else. You're just giving the kid the chance to wear a different style of clothes, or maybe have a different haircut or something like that. And that has been shown to allow youth to have a better, more stable sense of identity, and you get lower rates of this claim of like detransitioning or going back and forth as if it's just a phase. Like if you allow youth to have the space to explore, that kind of gives an opportunity to develop a more stable sense of self rather than like totally repressing it for years. In a sample of 300 transgender youth, those who experienced a delay in receiving gender affirming care specifically in this more social transitioning realm, were over 5 times more likely to experience depression and anxiety and 3 times more likely to engage in self-harming behaviors as compared to those who received care after communicating gender incongruence. So there's a lot of research around how gender affirming care can have positive psychosocial benefits. In a longitudinal study of 201 adolescents experiencing what this study called gender dysphoria that underwent puberty suppression, mean age in this sample was 15.74 years old, because we got to be that specific. Global functioning gradually improved throughout the evaluation periods across 18 months, specifically in mood improvement and school integration, meaning that kids with this school integration had more confidence, were able to be involved in activities in school. And it's also been shown to, like, gender affirming parenting has been shown to not only help youth in their gender identity, but also contributes to academic success, better relationships, and future-oriented planning, because it allows them not to be defined by this issue of their gender identity. Just moving on with your life is extremely healthy. So, like, continually harping on this of, like, you need to repress this, or this is harmful, or this or that, it's continuing to perpetuate harm for people. And I mean, we could dive into all of the negative effects of, restricting affirming care. But one thing that I do want to mention specifically in relation to the Baker article that I talked about earlier, there's often this misconception of, quote, rapid onset gender dysphoria, which kind of makes it seem like a social contaminant of, being around this idea or being around other kids that are experiencing this kind of thing can make your kid susceptible to experiencing it. And it really reaffirms, this idea of it's just a phase and you have to repress it in order to make it go away. There was a heavily critiqued survey that talked about, gender dysphoria being a rapid onset of social contaminants, which notably was a survey of parent perceptions. So it was a huge survey of parents, saying what their perception of gender dysphoria is and if it functions as a social contaminant and kind of like a rapid onset of you were exposed to the flu, so tomorrow you're going to start showing symptoms, kind of considered like that. Whereas actual clinical data and research with adolescents and gender expansive youth found the opposite to be true, that transgender adolescents experienced long-standing gender knowledge and a lack of support contributed to the development of adverse mental health outcomes. So there is this crux of it of believing youth when they say that they know themselves to be this way, or allowing them to have the space to explore these parts of themselves. That is the crux of a lot of this, is just whether you believe them to have that amount of self-knowledge. And of course, everything else proliferates from that, whether you're rejecting and condemning it or accepting and affirming that.
Yeah, I would just like to echo again something you said earlier. The reason that it's specifically trans youth under attack is because they are, like you said, that there is the big question of self-knowledge, which is interesting because it's I think in a lot of other discourses in I would say, especially, I don't know, this seems like a particularly American thing. Maybe it's not, but it's sometimes I think the discourse is, just let them explore, let them figure out who they are when you're young. But it's interesting how when it comes to other political ends or some sort of what I would consider the way you're describing the way that sometimes they're talking about becoming trans or catching the trans thing. It's pathological. And I think what's pathological is the way that discourses around anti-LGBTQ stuff, anti-trans stuff, that's really the pathology, because it's so easily spread.
I caught the trans guys.
Oh no.
Actually, because I realized that I was non-binary during the pandemic also, so I really did catch the
Wow.
trans.
But yeah, like especially as we're talking about giving youth the space to explore themselves, to develop a sense of self-knowledge, this demonizing of like puberty blockers is kind of ironic because in a lot of ways it can be preventative of like surgeries later on. So blockers aren't permanent and they may have side effects, but that's a whole other discussion because all medication has side effects and it requires someone to make the decision themselves. And I also want to mention that most like these decisions are not meant to be made just one person with a split decision, like a split thought. Like that is not how the system is set up to be. You cannot just on a whim decide to pursue any kind of treatment for transitioning and people just allow you to do it no matter what. A lot of times it includes, specifically if it's with a minor, any kind of puberty suppression or treatment in that way is governed by clinical care standards and includes an oversight team of specialists that include an endocrinologist, child and adolescent psychologist, and other practitioners for the specific medical needs. But it is important to note that like allowing youth the time to explore their gender identity and through puberty suppression, like prevents the development of secondary sex characteristics that, surgeries often are involved in, addressing later on. And that can be preventative of those types of treatments in the future, which do have a lot more permanent and irreversible impacts. Kind of going along with what you were saying, Cody, about the pathology and the medicalization, this has been like entangled with it since the beginning. Like in our system currently, medicine is seen as being necessary to legitimize a person's trans identity. You have to see a psychiatrist in order to get the sign off to even have or pursue certain treatments. So like, in other words, being trans must be diagnosed. You have to have that legitimation by a psychiatrist to receive that kind of care, and you have to comply with the medical and psychiatric authority.
Sorry, Julia, you can't self-diagnose.
I mean,
that's the way it is.
That's how the state sees it and like the system sees it. I mean, also to mention, historian Jules Gill Peterson speaks to this and how like ever since the beginning of these kinds of treatment options for any kind of gender affirming care, from like the 1900s, like psychiatry was involved in this as a way to also kind of sign off on any liability of the doctor that was doing the treatments. There was a lot less science and a lot less development around these kinds of treatments. So some doctors were scared to do it. And they were like, well, if I get a psychiatrist to sign off on it and say that they're, mentally ill enough to have this treatment available, then it also kind of pathologizes them and calls into question, any complaints that they can make in the future. And it also kind of, it was a way of protection almost. So like, invalidating them in the future, but also kind of saying like they were in such distress now, this was a need for them. So like that kind of pathologization and entanglement with psychiatry was a very early thing for trans affirming treatments in general. Sorry, went off on a little rant.
That's okay. This entire podcast has been good, but a little ranty and serious, which is fine. It's a serious topic.
I'm getting a lot of, reason and facts over here from Mr. Clayton.
I mean, love the Western construct of knowledge through science.
Talk dirty to me. Wow.
Whoa. Okay.
That's just the vibes I got from that. I'm not gonna lie.
You just love data in here and no other
no
other ways of knowledge production.
I want to acknowledge that we place some focus and concentration on gender affirming care and the institution of medicine, but I want to recognize that this medical model of transition and the medicalization of trans folks is problematic in itself. As such, you can find a link in our show notes to a recent talk given by Dr. Jules Gill Peterson titled Gender Underground: A Trans History of Do It Yourself, where she problematizes this model and reliance on medical care, which has so often villainized trans people in the first place. Now, for our last segment, we recorded this conversation in the fall of 2023. It was a conversation where we were somewhat reeling from the anti-LGBTQ discourse and policies that had swept across different states in the nation, and also the contentious Pride season over the summer of 2023. I want to just open this up to anyone who wants to pick a queer or trans issue that's happened since 8 months ago. So this can just be like breaking out our LGBTQ bingo boards of all the shit that's been happening. And I can just give a quick overview of some of the stuff that I was reading over. There's, of course, been the trans healthcare bans, trans sports bans. There's been the LGBTQ, or just more broadly, book bans that have been happening. Florida expanded their Don't Say Gay bill to all ages in the public school system, so up to 12th grade. There was the Bud Light controversy where they just hung Dylan Mulvaney out to dry. And there was also
some queer beer.
Queer beer goes together very well, though. And then there was also the Pride merchandise at Target whole thing. So lots to discuss.
But I feel like this would be like the world's most depressing bingo card. It's like, what are they doing? What are the straights doing nowadays?
Well, I mean, it is a depressing time. Similarly, there have been 417 anti-LGBTQ bills that have been introduced in state legislatures across the United States this year, which is a new record according to the ACLU.
I think the number might be higher. I think it's closer to 600 at this point.
It might be. I could not find a more recent article, and the ACLU is not giving the number for all of the states. It's giving numbers per state, and I don't have the time to count that up. But for Kansas has introduced 14 bills, and I know SB 228 was passed into law despite being vetoed, which is about disability services, I think. But I also know...
No, I think that was the one about defining gender. Defining man and woman by biology.
That might have been it. It's just when it pops up on the Kansas legislative session, that's what it says. They also passed 180 and HB 2238. One of that is the Fairness in Women's Sports BS. And then the other one is the Women's Bill of Rights to provide a meaning of biological sex. So those are the three in Kansas that have passed, despite I think all of them were vetoed by Laura Kelly.
Yeah. Yeah, the sports bill one was very interesting because there was one session where someone even asked one of the representatives advocating for the bill, because the bill does leave some language about having to prove that you're a female to participate in female sports. And one of the questions was so are we going to be rounding up kindergartners and making them prove their private parts to show us if they can play in sports and stuff? And there was never a straight answer on that. So they were just well, I mean, we'll leave that to the local schools who make those decisions. So that's some fun stuff here in Kansas. I remember reading a lot about that. And then the other bill about defining, what gender is, and basically codifying that there's only two genders as they correlate to the quote unquote two biological sexes. So looking at the numbers that I have, I don't have anything more recent than May, but from what I see, as of May of 2023, and this is from the Rights Campaign, there was about 520 anti-LGBTQ bills, and obviously the majority of which were anti-trans bills. So
It's yeah, no, it's spreading like throughout Europe too. It's like what I know for sure is like, and even in Iceland, which is like Icelanders and the country likes to pride itself as being very progressive when it comes to gender and these kind of things. But recently, there's been a lot of backlash on the like trans rights fronts as well. Like there's this group called, it's basically like it's a turf organization. Well, it's not a turf because it's actually done by just like a gay man who's Icelandic but lives in the UK. But he's made like this entire, so it's an alternative to the the National Queer Rights organization, and it's yeah basically trans. It's just yeah trans exclusionary. And so actually, there's been like a series of, I have friends who work for the like National Queer Organization here, and there's been a series of crisis meetings because it's just like the backlash is just getting super overwhelming, and so they've had, and to respond to that, it hasn't been anything in legislature as far as I know, so that's I guess part of the difference, but it has been very like felt attitude wise, and a lot of trans people just not feeling safe anymore, and even with like during Pride, it was like talked about, and like people were feeling a little bit unsafe and uncomfortable during Pride. So it's yeah, it's happening everywhere, and of course, like it feels like you can directly feel it as a response to everything happening in the U.S. of people looking at the developments in the U.S. and like sort of I guess gaining inspiration or courage from that in some weird way. And so it's yeah, that's the
Yeah, but
biggest
I
thing
mean,
I've noticed personally.
I think characterizing this wave as starting and coming from the US is not correct. The UK has been and is very transphobic, and it has been for a long time, especially England. I think that if I think to ignore that J.K. Rowling didn't play a part in the rise of transphobia around the world, but especially in the UK and also in America. Like I think it is easy to paint America as like this these things are coming from the backwards parts of the country or the South or the religious right. And yes, part of that is true, but I also like we need to be wary of the like anyone can be transphobic, and it doesn't just come from the places that especially liberals like to stereotype as like not progressive or as dumb, and a lot of those places are the poor places in the United States.
what's the Taylor Swift song? Just Need to Calm Down
Yeah.
music video. Like
Oh
Yeah.
yeah,
walking
that's
in
the
the
thing.
trailer park, just being like, "Oh, we're queer, deal with it,"
Yeah.
because I'm Taylor Swift. When I went to Scotland in 2019, that was kind of the first time I was introduced to one, the word TERF, as in trans exclusionary radical feminism, and like just the whole gender critical controversy that's happening. So that was like over 4 years ago now, and still just seeing like how entrenched that issue was, and like how just the vitriol that was going back and forth. And then I hadn't really been exposed to that here in the US, but it's definitely become more of a thing in the past 4 years. So I think there are like ways that, we can be cognizant of how issues come up in different places and then just kind of seep into the whole discourse.
It's kind of reminds me of just in general, Savannah Sean Gay's book Progressive Dystopia, which is about like gentrification in San Francisco and how it's spilling over into like the school system that's supposed to be for breaking the school to prison pipeline, but then it's like slowly being taken over by white liberals. It just feels like the progressive dystopias of these places that like, and it doesn't even have to be a place, or it could be as like what we're talking about here with just, a society that's seen as like progressive or forward thinking in social issues in some ways, but then it's actually leading to breakage points and dead ends at these certain issues around like trans rights and things like that. And it just feels a bit like an echo of like colonial legacies of like the UK in many places in the world, but notably I know I've done some research on this in Hong Kong, where like a lot of the anti like LGBT legislation still on the docket in Hong Kong is from when it was a British colony. So it's like it shouldn't be entirely surprising that these so-called like liberal progressive societies are where a lot of this backlash is coming from and starting from.
Yeah. I also think like it would be good to discuss Pride itself is its own weird like capitalistic thing, but it was weird and kind of scary to see a lot of these companies who have like supported LGBT people for the past couple of years. I put quotation marks around that because I don't actually think it's support.
Profited off of
Yes,
LGBT.
profited off of us, but they didn't. A lot of companies didn't even want to attempt that this year because of the backlash that a lot of other companies who did support or like did do something for Pride received. Like Bud Light is I think a really well-known example in terms of Dylan Mulvaney receiving Bud Light to do promotion and then getting Dylan Mulvaney is a famous trans person on TikTok, for those who don't know, like millions of followers. And then when Bud Light and her received backlash for that, Bud Light basically just left her in the dust. And she is kind of more explicitly talked about it lately, but like it was a terrifying moment for her specifically, in the way that they like backed away from that and never even contacted her to like give her condolences or anything.
Yeah, I feel like the Bud Light controversy was like just so it perfectly encapsulated the like liberal conservative divide we were kind of talking about earlier, because just like drinking beer and Bud Light is seen as such like a Southern country white man kind of thing to do.
True elsewhere to a certain extent, but it's the strong association it has is only like that strong. It's so much stronger in the US than I feel like anywhere else, because anywhere like most anywhere else I've been in Europe, it's just like beer is kind of just like the standard, and then there's stuff on top of that, but everybody drinks beer. So I don't know, it's so strange to me. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, but I think also like there's I think different connotations with beer versus Bud Light. Like I think Bud Light specifically is
Yeah, that's true too.
seen more so connected to the South than beer in general is. Because like if you were to say that beer does not have any connection to the LGBT community, the lesbians are going to have an issue, you know.
But it's not like
The craft beer, the craft
Yeah,
beer lesbians.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. But yeah, I would still say like yeah, cheap beer just is different from saying a specific brand as well. And yes, that does make sense. But yeah, I need to make more craft beer lesbian friends, I think. I would get along very well with them.
But I
Well,
mean, like, I've talked to family that I have in like North Carolina, Georgia areas and stuff. And at this point, everybody knows about the fiasco with Dylan Mulvaney, like, especially the conservatives. And to many people, it's a joke to like buy Bud Light now because it's
it's
just
kind of like being gay. Like,
right, exactly. Like
yeah.
it's almost a scarlet letter. Like my cousin, she is friends with this older dude, and like she was like, he always drinks Bud Light. He loves Bud Light. He has a cooler like all the time filled with Bud Light. And then the Dylan Mulvaney thing happens, and he will not touch a Bud Light again. And she bought him a pack of Bud Light as a joke for his birthday to try to get him to drink it. But it's like it's just so sad to me. Like this is something so
Innocuous.
banal.
Well, and it's weird too, because I mean, I know a lot of queer people who won't buy or drink Bud Light too because of their lack of response to the whole situation, or just in general the way that they responded to it. But like, I remember a moment where I was the big liquor store in Manhattan, Kansas over the summer, and I usually spend a lot of time looking at like the craft beer section, trying to figure out what I want to buy. But as I'm like passing this other dude and like passing by the Bud Light, they make some sort of like snarky comment about like how it hasn't really sold that well. And as I'm there, I just go and I pick the Bud Light because I'm like, fuck you. Like,
Money communicates things.
Yeah, it does.
And it's so frustrating that like this is the part of the like this is the conversation that's being had. It's like if there's any kind of commitment that these companies actually had to valuing the LGBTQ community, like could you imagine what would have happened if all these other beer companies would have gone, you know what? We actually stand with Bud Light and Dylan Mulvaney and the trans community, and it's not cool that y'all are acting like this. What are people going to do? Boycott every single beer company and just not drink beer?
Yeah.
But, you know, we live in this capitalist monopoly that one company makes a misstep and they're hung out to dry, which I don't really care if Bud Light succeeds or not. And I know they're owned by a more conglomerate company for beer and everything else, so I don't really care. But it's just like the statements that are being made, really, I do care about those.
Yeah.
With this controversy and these kind of things, it does seem to ring quite strongly of just like the masculine position is being uncertain of sort of and always needing to reaffirm your gender identity in these sorts of ways.
Did y'all know that Ted Cruz called for an investigation into Bud Light because of their partnership with Dylan Mulvaney?
No, but I can't say that surprises me.
It was an actual thing in May. Ted Cruz urged, I don't know, some regulating body in the government, basically saying Bud Light should be investigated because of their partnership with Dylan Mulvaney, claiming that they broke the law in doing so. The law he claims that they broke. So basically, like as part of the whole legal apparatus of alcohol regulation and everything else, alcohol companies aren't allowed to market to minors because they obviously can't buy their product. So marketing to them wouldn't be encouraging them to break the law. So Ted Cruz's case was that Dylan Mulvaney, at the time a 26-year-old who is older than the legal drinking age of 21, has an audience that has a significant portion of people younger than 21. So the fact that Bud Light partnered with Dylan Mulvaney means that they both broke the law in marketing alcohol products to minors. So that was the whole platform that Ted Cruz and Marsha Blackburn and other politicians went down, trying to basically punish Bud Light for being trans inclusive in a media campaign, which is just really wild to me, to like try to weaponize the government on something like that, on your own anti-trans beliefs and attitudes and everything else. There were some concerns brought up. I'm not calling them legitimate, but like one of them being that Dylan Mulvaney and the Bud Light company didn't censor the post for accounts under 16 years old. So according to Meta policy, any post with alcohol should be censored for accounts under 16 years old. Apparently, that was not a feature that Dylan Mulvaney activated in her Instagram post, so minors were able to see the post. But it's still wild that Ted Cruz, an actual senator of the US, is bringing forth a whole investigation and trying to be like, hey, see, they broke Instagram's policy. We need to punish them.
Target has kind of did something similar during Pride. They put out their whole Pride line, which they always have done for like, I don't know, the past couple of years.
Over 10 years.
Yeah. They received such strong backlash from people that they ended up pulling not all of the line, but they pulled some of the stuff that more specifically got a lot of the backlash.
A lot of the controversy, like Julia mentioned, was about specific apparel and like swimsuits and stuff. One thing that I was reading about said that there was a swimsuit that had extra padding in the groin area for people to tuck and have that extra space. And then a lot of people on TikTok and Facebook and other things were claiming that Target was selling these to children and young kids, when in actuality, like, this was adult swim apparel. There was also like claims that one of the merchandisers that Target used for the merchandise was selling stuff that was like very satanic and pagan iconography and stuff. And in actuality, like, that wasn't merchandise being sold by Target, but one of Target's merchandisers also sold that, like, on their own store and things like that. So there were a lot of like conspiracies going around about what Target was actually selling. And then that led a lot of customers to go in and confront Target employees, yell at them, harass them, etc., and also go in and destroy the Pride displays. So a lot of Targets kind of took back their merchandise or either relocated their Pride section from the front of the store to like the back of the store to kind of cut down on that. And it was all in the name of employee safety with them, which I feel very ambivalent about, because obviously if I was an employee there, I wouldn't want to be dealing with harassment just because of Pride merchandise that I don't have any control over. But at the same time, like you were saying, Julia, it does send a message, because like I remember in late May, a friend and we like had a whole Pride shopping day where we went to see like different stores across town and their new Pride sections and seeing what they were selling and stuff. And it was very obviously capitalistic and neoliberal and everything else, but it is kind of a fun thing to be like, oh, this stuff is for me.
Let's see what new gadgets they came up with.
Right.
Yeah.
How many new water bottles they've released.
What new things did they slap the lesbian pride flag on?
We all say as we pull out all this Pride merchandise.
But I also think like the importance of it to me though is like it's very subtle, but like I have a rainbow colored what's it called, lanyard, like for my keychain for my car keys and stuff. And like when I just want to be very subtle, I just like pull it out and like set it on the table. If I'm trying to like send a signal to anyone of any type, it's just like I feel like that's what the positive aspect of having this kind of stuff is too as well. It is showing, oh, it's for you and like whatever, but it's also you can use it as a signal to other people, and just the point of having like
Seeing
all the
who's part of the
businesses
family or a friend of Dorothy.
yeah. Exactly. Who can I? It's most of the time I used for who can I hit on, but yeah, it also has its other benefits for sure.
But
So like it is
I mean,
important
it
for
does
these
fit
things, I
in
think.
with this lineage of like gay, queer, and trans practices of, the codes and the symbolism, and just being like, who is a friend of Dorothy? Who is part of the family? Who, and
Mhm.
kind of seeking out connections in that way. One of the comments that I did want to mention, so they claim to have lost money over their Pride merchandise in June. Christina Hennington, Target's chief growth officer, talking about the losses that they experienced during Pride Month. She said, "The reaction is a signal for us to pause, adapt, and learn so that our future approach to these moments balances celebration, inclusivity, and broad-based appeal."
What the fuck?
Right. Like,
How out
really?
of touch. Jesus Christ.
Like, that's the
Maybe
signal we're
not. Maybe not.
getting?
Oh my God. Holy shit.
I think it perfectly captures like the capitalist
Yeah,
mindset of it though. Like,
exactly.
this
Yeah.
means that we need to reflect on be how we can celebrate inclusivity, but also make sure our appeal is very broad based and like just have broad
Inclusive,
strokes.
inclusive, but not too inclusive of too many, different specific people, because then the masses will feel left out if we're too inclusive.
Yeah, nobody
Yeah.
wants to anger the straights.
No, not at all, obviously.
And like that's also a thing for a lot of the politicians now, is like they're doing the sound bites and the media clips just to get attention, just to get on Fox News or MSNBC or anything else. And they're just like stirring these more shallow debates. But like, I definitely want to talk a little bit about this, talking about book bans, but these may not be entirely shifting attitudes. I mean, thinking of like Christmas versus holiday and like season's greetings, kind of cliche words, like that kind of does signal a shifting attitude. But something like this, that's such a like almost light switch difference, is a little bit different because it's not only who has a platform, but also who has power to be heard, who has the privilege to sit there and create TikToks and blog posts and Facebook posts and tweets and everything else, and do all that kind of stuff instead of working and being a good productive capitalist citizen, or any other thing in their life. It does take a lot of time, and you see a lot of these people who are being loud about this and have a platform, especially with politicians. There's usually advocacy groups and lobbyist groups behind them that are doing most of the legwork. And, these kinds of rhetoric that they're putting forth may not.
They don't skip a leg day. They don't skip a leg day. Sorry, that was terrible. Anyways.
It was really bad. But yeah, I mean, like, it may sound like they have a big audience behind them advocating for what they're saying, but like in reality, a lot of them don't. It's just like other people have lives and they're not sitting there worried about Target's merchandise. And that's kind of sad and unfortunate thing, because then you get the voices of the few who are having these really impactful conversations. I don't even want to call them conversations. But thinking of like book bans, tons of books are getting banned. Or a significant portion of these are LGBTQ books. Anything that mention sexuality, sexual orientation, gender identity, a lot of that is happening under the auspices of pornography. So mentioning sexual identity somehow has been related to pornography, and thus a lot of parent activism is going into that, which is also really misleading. Like a lot of these kinds of conversations and stuff are framed as like parents' rights and parents' choice, but it's not even parents who are the ones saying this. It's often lobbyist groups and advocacy groups and stuff.
If it was about parents' rights or parents' choice, it should be up to you as the parent to determine what your child reads and does and all that stuff. And you should be paying attention to what your child engages with. But that's not what they care about, because it's also about parents' rights to let their kids look at queer stuff. But they don't care about that shit.
Like, just the term parents' right, like parents' activism just sounds so misleading to me in general, because it's like the activism, a lot of it is about, just saying no. I hate that term so much.
To give an idea of things, in 2019, this is the pre-pandemic year, the American Library Association recorded that 377 challenges for book bans were brought forth, and this was against 566 titles. These numbers have spiked in the years following COVID. COVID doesn't really count because a lot of libraries were closed during that time period, and etc. But especially 2022, and then of course this year broke the records of 2022. Just in the first 8 months of 2023, the American Library Association tracked 695 challenges to library materials compared to 681 during the same time period last year. So we're a little over, but there was a 20% jump in the number of unique titles that were challenged, and that was a total of 1,915 books that were challenged just in the first 8 months of this year. One thing that I was reading was saying that the actual number of people that are challenging these has actually gone down. According to the Washington Post, book challengers themselves are very few, even though there's been over like 1,900 book titles that have been challenged. So the Washington Post reported that only 11 people are responsible for 60% of the filings nationwide. And a lot of times on the filings, you get people filing for hundreds of book titles instead of just one book at a time. So this just points to the fact that groups like Moms for Liberty and like other groups, this is more of just a political stunt and power grab than an actual indication of like mindset shifts and social change and like actual parent backlash. This is just the backlash of 11 people, or at least 60% of it is. So
the issue to me is that, yes, I know, and it is easy to see when you're tracking these bills and these book bans, that a lot of this is being pushed by the same groups of people. But the issue is that it is having like a real effect on people's stances and opinions about trans people. And also just not enough people who say that they're allies are like really stepping up to the plate to do a lot of work to combat a lot of this. I think it's easy and it is true to say that a lot of the backlash is a very loud group, but because they're being loud, they're having a lot of influence over people's like attitudes and perceptions about our community.
kind of like we talked about in one of the last episodes, like even if these policies and legislations are coming up and then like getting vetoed or they don't have enough support to pass, like they still have an effect. Like this anti-queer and anti-trans like attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, it's just circulating in the air, and it does have very real impact on students at universities, on people just having a pride flag on their shop or their home.
It's weird. It feels like there's just lots of like shifting attitudes. There's spaces I've been in that have felt distinctly unsafe that I don't think would have been unsafe like a couple of years ago. Like I remember the town that I now live in has kind of this event called Luma, where it's like a lights art festival where these projections play on buildings around downtown. And one of the buildings had part of their thing of the like projection was like they had a pride moment. And I remember being there with one of my friends and the people around us kind of like scoffing. I don't remember if they said anything. But I remember like a whole bunch of them like leaving angry and stuff. And just, I remember feeling like distinctly unsafe in that moment because I only had like one other person with me, you know, and it was nighttime downtown. And I don't think that would have gotten that reaction if that projection or that show had been there a couple of years earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll be honest, I've felt similar in a lot of ways. Like even the Pride event this year in the town that I'm in, which is like one of the most liberal and progressive in Kansas, which isn't saying much, but like even just going to Pride, I was extremely nervous about it because like there had been a lot of mass shootings at that time and like a lot of stuff in the news about that kind of thing. And it's like all it takes is one disgruntled person who gets a gun and, you know, you're in a crowd and there's nowhere to go. And I don't know.
And it's like, it's been a sad moment sometimes for me too, because like I've seen who I assume is my grandfather, because he uses my grandmother's Facebook account, like post like anti-trans stuff on Facebook. And like I've known for my entire life that he is he's a Republican, you know, he watches Fox News a lot. But like he came to Lavender graduation. He watched me win an award for my LGBT activism on campus. Like he knows, you should be aware, you know, of how much that I care for that community because I am a part of it. Even as a non-binary person who is not like actively transitioning, like seeing those things, it just really upset me at the time because I was like, I brought you into this space for me and my friends' accomplishments for graduating and getting through this university as queer people. And to basically spit in my face about that, maybe a month or so later, just really upset me at the time.
Yeah, it's really bad.
And I don't think he would have said or posted something like that like a year or two ago. I think he still would have had similar opinions, but I don't think he would have said them. Or he more so would have had opinions of like, you do what you do, basically.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where it's like if it wouldn't have become a big deal, like people just wouldn't have been thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, and trans people have existed for a long time. They've been around in the United States, like transitioning actively for a long time, but nobody really cared in the same fashion or in this like outrage fashion like they are today.
It does make me wonder, like, I guess going forward, what this kind of work looks like, specifically in like scholarship and more academic spaces of, in a lot of ways, queer and trans studies was rooted in queer and trans activism. And like a lot of the contributions of like queer of color critique was really based in this like on the ground activism and lived experience and those kinds of like felt knowledges as source of a social analysis. Seems like we got to a point around like, the Obama presidencies where people were like, oh, things are getting better. We can be hopeful. Like we can start to make real progress and have happy homonormative lives and that kind of thing. And then 2016 happens and everybody's kind of in shock and like, oh, wait a second. Like, how did this come about? And Coda, you and I talked about this a little, but like there was the whole series of like queer futures in cultural anthropology with like Semini Howe and Tom Belstorff and others kind of talking about how their origins and like queer anthropology and queer scholarship has morphed into different issues of like interspecies scholarship or like environmental scholarship and kind of using those queer bent analyses in different ways outside of just like sex and gender issues. But like, I don't know, it just makes me wonder at like what the state is of now in the sense that like a lot of that stuff seemed to be happening in the time where people were thinking things were getting better, not just in the US, but in a lot of other places. And I kind of mentioned this to Julia earlier, but like about now is the time that we're starting to get this wave of books and things that were written in a post 2016 period. So it just makes me think of like where queer and trans scholarship may go when we're faced with a lot of these same old problems. And it's like we have the social analyses and frameworks and concepts to dissect it and analyze it and theorize it all, but we're still facing the same problems.
Yeah, and it seems to me it's like that a bit of my takeaway from like the work of scholars perhaps anthropologists who started in queer anthropology but kind of moved away is that like some of the reason, for example, like Simony and other people moving in more into environmentalism, and although, yeah, like as you say, there is the sort of queer lenses coming through and same sort of approaches to things, but like it's also environmentalism and things like this are taking over, and to some extent, it is much easier to find departments throughout the world, like a lot of people working in environmentalism, environmental humanities, and things like that. So, like this, sort of, to me, this kind of does show a bit of a, shrinking of positions, like professor positions and PhD positions for people who want to work in queer issues, which does direct, also have an effect on keeping track of these trends and like continuing to document them from these perspectives. And like, we've gone into in past episodes about, academia and its effects for like on the ground practical grassroots efforts and its effect on just general the state of affairs and progressing in queer issues or whatever like this. But at the same time, it does clearly has an effect on like if we're less able, there's less funding for these academic positions focusing on queer issues, things like that. It's definitely an effect of some sorts of keeping abreast of these tides and maintaining the sort of like sharpness to counteract and to try to resist them in any ways possible. But also just like, I have the sense of also like, the funding for if the funding for people studying queer issues drops or is lowering and positions are drying up a bit, then it can also lead to less queer people in academia, less queer people in these sorts of spaces, challenging the dominant narratives and ideals.
Yeah, I mean, it's already been hard for queer people in academia, and I don't foresee that this shift in perspective, I guess, is going to change that. But I also don't know that the solution is academia.
I definitely agree. It's not that academia has to have a place here or is the like ideal position of making change, because a lot of the change happens on the ground. And even like if there isn't political change like we want to see, there's still communities of care that we create, networks of mutual aid, and making sure we can stay safe and create our own niches in the world to exist and be true selves. But like it does make me wonder, thinking of all the analyses and all the theories and stuff that come up in ways of conceptualizing things like the actual, I don't know, I guess I'm just getting into an existential crisis of like what actually does cause meaningful change and make life better for people.
Real serious concluding thoughts. Take care of yourself, find queer community. I think it's some of the best medicine at this time, knowing other people who know what you're dealing with. It's easy to feel like you're alone in these moments, and you are not, and there are people around you who will help you not feel alone.
So that's a wrap. Hopefully, this mashup of 3 conversations covering the span of over a year and a half was interesting to you. There is so much that we couldn't talk about or had to cut just for time's sake in putting it all in one episode. But I do want to emphasize here as we are ending that LGBTQ issues do not exist in a silo. They are connected to racism, classism, ableism, colonialism, and so much more. We encourage you to engage in research and dive deeper into the topics that you found interesting and spoke to you, but also the topics that are affecting people around you. At the time this episode is releasing, we are beginning an election year in the US and also the state legislative sessions across the country. The stakes are high, so we encourage you to get involved and start organizing if you're not already, find community. And in closing, I just want to echo Julia's words. Find others around you, build relationships, and care for yourself in these times.